particular issues and considerations we've had around the development of a prototype discovery tool, and also some of the ways in which we've been thinking through those issues. So, obviously, dealing with the issue of born digital, dealing with the issue of email is not in of itself new, and we very much come to it as researchers who have been informed by a lot of the focus in this area that's come before. So, for instance, people like Chris Prom and colleagues who have had a particular interest in emails historically, and their reports on this very much sort of influenced our considerations from a research perspective on how we might start dealing with emails. And one of the first things I think that it's worth highlighting is that from our perspective, we align with a lot of the views around born digital email, which is that it represents something that is materially different, certainly from our practice as researchers. So this excerpt from the Future of Email Archives report really sort of captures that. So electronic records in archival repositories, especially email messages, are fundamentally different. Traditional paper-based series of correspondence are often uniform in their contents and structure, whereas email collections include both formal and informal communications. Mass mailings from listservs and even visited advertising that, when combined with the volume of messages, makes traditional records management difficult, if not impossible. And so that speaks from the records management side, but as I say, from our experience researching using emails, that really resonated with us, because certainly things like unsolicited emails and all at emails are something that we very much had to deal with as we tried to make sense of the content in the emails that we were trying to use for our research purposes. So that was really an entry point into us starting to think more specifically about born digital and email specifically. So I'm aware that many people in the audience will have some familiarity with the themes on this slide, but I thought it was worth, particularly given with the first presentation of the day, to just verbalise some assumptions and some thoughts around born digital access and discovery that have really sort of guided us as we've worked through this project, and some of the premises from which we feel that this is important research to be doing. So. Firstly, born digital collections, many of these remain inaccessible in some form or dark, while often it's access issues and the way in which that access is going to be mediated and provided that are being negotiated. Now, clearly, there's a large collection of issues around and how we deal with born digital collections and make these available, but certainly some of the issues there relate to the basis and nature of that access. And where we do have collections that are available, our experience and the experience of people that we're speaking to, and it certainly in our field of business history and management and organizational research, there was a feeling that if you're going to do research in this area, it can be quite difficult to search these collections, particularly if you want to do so qualitatively. So there's been some really interesting and successful research that do more sort of quantitative or structural research on these collections, making use of things like topic modelling. But to read these resources is a challenge that we don't necessarily have a great deal of method or practice to help us with at this stage. So connected to this from both a research perspective and of course a records management perspective, we have these ethical and privacy implications from large digital collections that are clearly very serious, but also to a certain extent ambiguous and unclear. We have some unknowns to deal with when we're dealing with these things, both as researchers, but and the various sort of other stakeholders around these resources. And we very much align with the idea that dealing with some of these problems around access can benefit from this idea of collaboration both sides of the reading room, and that's really what we hope to try and do with some of our work, is provide or contribute to that other side perspective on some of these issues. So with that in mind, as I say, we're a lot of what we're doing with our research, even though we are, as part of it, developing tools for discovery is to actually try and contribute towards a user perspective around Born Digital. So particularly, as I say, coming from our own discipline, where we have a particular interest in businesses and organizations. And one of the main reasons why we're interested in doing this is because Born Digital sources are vital already, and going to be increasingly vital for those scholars, whether from a social science or historical or other perspective, who wish to look at the post-analog past. Where you have the absence of those sources, you have a significant gap in the insight that you can generate on those pasts, and that's something that we think is really important as the point at which digital technologies and digital communications became normal becomes ever more part of the period we now regard as history. This being said, the scale and complexity of the data available on this is going to present challenges to a lot of what are predominantly analog assumptions. As I say, this is particularly with an assumption around some level of qualitative research. So, for instance, if you were trained as a historian, a lot of your training will relate to an assumption that you are going to be doing some research on physical pre-digital collections, and some of those assumptions don't necessarily hold true as you move towards digital. And of course, on the positive side, there are some really great affordances that these resources offer us. So some things that we specifically highlighted when we've been looking at presenting the benefits of Born Digital to our community are the fact that you can generate new perspectives. So you can highlight marginalized actors who would perhaps not have so much voice in other archival contexts. You can also perhaps show day-to-day life more as you include more of the organization and what goes on in that organization over time. You also have the scope for more contextual specificity. So this is not to say that you have to go down to using this as the primary focus of your research, but being able to complement your understanding of the content of these sources with things like really accurate data, dating and timing, and a really clear understanding of audience and reach adds a new element to how you might go about generating new knowledge. Finally, advanced searchability, so the ability to do scaled searches and also show how these searches were made. So a level of replicability is something that, again, we would not necessarily see in other contexts. Excuse me. That being said, it's really important to I think acknowledge the fact that when you're dealing with something like this, you have different users with different user interests and different uses for these resources, and I think that presents a challenge that's to a certain extent general to these sorts of materials, but also has some specific considerations when we think about digital. So when we think about digital and some of the uses that I would expect my colleagues within a business school to perhaps use, we might expect them to actually want as complete a data set as possible in high fidelity with warts and all, and to do what they want with that data and use their own methodological means to generate some insight from it. So they want it in its original form. That said, other users may well expect a level of curation, but also don't necessarily have that much experience in what this curation would look like in a Born Digital context. So with that in mind, we've very much been influenced and aligned with the idea that Calvin and Underdown highlight, which is these three different user types. So on the one hand, you're likely to see interested stakeholders that are going to want to read a digital source in very much a traditional way, and they're going to want a user and access experience that follows that. At the other end of the spectrum, you're also going to have those interested users that are going to want the complete collection, so they can do their own computational analysis, they can render the data in their own way, and as much of the collection in its original form as possible is what they're going to want to see. Where we focus most of our attention is on this middle group, the digitally curious. So these are people who may want to search a large database and identify interesting and important themes that they will then delta in on and do more in-depth study into. So they don't necessarily have the background knowledge of the collection to focus in and become a reader straight away. They want to have that ability to scale up and then scale in. And in a way, the collection of these different users, and also the sort of ambiguity around the digitally curious and the unknowns about how that process will work, led us to this question of how will users actually engage with these Born Digital archives once the access issues have been negotiated, and this becomes very much more the norm for researchers to be engaging with these Born Digital collections. And this is where we became interested in email as a specific case. Now, this is partly off the back of the fact that we had our own individual experience with email. One of our collaborators, David Kirsch, has experience in saving and preserving email, and we have experience using email for our research. So it was something we already had a familiarity with and an interest in. And email is also interesting because it's quite specific. Certainly, there are characteristics that we can connect to other sort of network communication forms, but email is a very important and relatively specific form of Born Digital resource. And part of that comes from its networked nature. So this network nature is key to meaningful access, we argue. So email is, for a start, a hybrid artifact in many ways. So yes, we can have an email in and of itself. So email is, but at the same time, email exists as a collection of networked communication with nodes and ties, and actually making sense of those individual emails. A lot of that comes from being able to understand the broader context. And therefore, when we deal with the information preserved in email, we're not just dealing with the content of emails, we're dealing with that context. And what's interesting here is a lot of the research done, certainly in our area, on email is actually focusing primarily on these, what we would see as contextual aspects of content. So, for instance, there's been research on frequency, so things like reciprocity of messaging and networking within an email archive to look at an organization and how networks exist. At the same time, others have looked at things like timing norms and the sequencing of email communications. And finally, instead of the content, the language of the content itself can be the thing to study. Either in all cases, the content of the email is secondary to the fact that there are these characteristics that the researchers are interested in. We see the route to making the content more meaningful and useful is to provide both individual and network aspect of email, i.e., the content and context factor, and that's the focus of where our research was then directed. And in this regard, we've had a couple of projects on the go. One's concluded and one's ongoing, and really we're focused here on firstly focusing particularly on a historical use perspective of Born Digital sources like email. So this could be trying to generate contributions that are focused on history specifically, or where history is being used to provide, say, a theoretical contribution. We're also interested in reflecting on Born Digital discovery, and in particular the use of artificial intelligence and email as a source. So how can artificial intelligence potentially help in the process of connecting context and content? And then finally, the ultimate aim is that we can describe an approach that allows us to do better research using organizational email and in connecting that content context. And just to quickly summarize the first of our projects before I hand over to Stephanie. So the first project, which is now concluded, which was took place in 2020 and 2021. This explored essentially ways of initially making these relational links within a database. So what we did was we used a failed US.com company's email archive. It wasn't the company on the screen now. It was a company that we've since anonymized. And we used this data that had been preserved and made available by the Linguistic Data Consortium. So we had an email archive available to us, and then with the help of colleagues at the TNA, we created essentially the back end of a prototype tool for searching this email, and we also used this tool to create a digital history telling the story of this company in 4 short vignettes. And this is that website. So contextualizing email archives, and you can go to this. It's available today. It's on Bristol's university's domain, and there are 4 short stories that deal with things like the strategy of the company, its issues around its burn rate, and things like that. And so that was very much the first stage of the project. The second stage is how we develop that prototype on and think a bit more about those questions. But for that, I'll hand over to Stephanie.
Thank you, Adam. So as Adam said, this was the first part of the project, or the first half of our project that we are presenting today. And this was an email archive of a company that we cannot divulge the name and some of the content. So we have special permission to have the digital history available, but we couldn't really make available the search tool or show what results we had. So we felt we would really like to continue with this research, but actually get a better understanding of how people then would engage with research and go beyond the level of, you know, us considering how we would use it. But clearly, we couldn't use this company. And as a result, we ended up bidding for funding from the University of Illinois, who runs, they run a re-grant project with the Andrew Mellon Foundation in the US. So in the first round, there were a number of funded institutions, and we were lucky in round 2 to gain some funding. So our collaborator from the University of Maryland, David Kirsch, is PI on this project, which we're calling MCODIST. So it's the email contextualization discovery search tool. And this is the second part of the project, which I'll be presenting. And this is one where you can actually see how the search tool works, and you get a bit more of an in-depth sense of our assumptions and how we're actually trying to make email archives available as content and as something that you read. And as you may know or not know, with email archives, it can be a problem getting to the content because a lot of the uses have been structural, largely because for many emails, you don't have the rights to actually access those collections in full. But there's obviously one very well-known exception to this, and this is the email archive we're using. Now, our working hypothesis for this second part of the project was really to think about whether a relatively complete email archive and what that means in the context of email is a big question, because obviously email is always a snapshot at a certain point in time, with emails that are older probably having been deleted by the people who created them or received them. And obviously there is a sort of horizon beyond which you won't be able to get those emails. Still, we feel with a relatively complete archive of emails, you may be able to answer a number of questions because you have that fine-grained, detailed, you know, communication between individuals that you wouldn't necessarily get with any kind of other source. And we also felt you could answer the most important questions about an organization. They could be historical, but they could also be much more driven by social science concerns. There may also be, in some cases, journalistic, depending on how recent you'll be able to gain access to an email archive. Now, for us, email presents a methodological problem in that sense, because while we know there's valuable insight in there, without the context to the collection, it can be really quite difficult to actually find the pieces that are of relevance to you, or you might come in with wrong assumptions about what you're able to find in an email archive. So for someone who goes to an email archive and tries to read it, to understand the content, understand who was interacting, what was their relationship, what was the significance of what they were talking about, you need a pretty large degree of sort of contextual knowledge that you do not always get with email archives. So we were thinking around a tool that would allow readers to actually develop that knowledge of an email collection, particularly if it's an email collection of an organization that maybe you don't know that much about, because every organization we know creates email. Now, if you knew the name of the company we used for the first part, it would tell you nothing. You will most likely have never heard of this company, and you wouldn't have been able to locate it. So you wouldn't even know why you would want to look at those emails. Now, for the second part, we're actually looking at the Enron email. So that's a lot more familiar to people. But I'll talk a little bit more about why the Enron emails suffer from a similar problem in terms of how you approach that email data set if you wanted to read and find out interesting things, maybe relevant to certain questions you may have. Now, we were trying to think about how would you in a traditional archive go about trying to make sense of the data, because coming into an archive and having too much material and having perhaps a collection structure that is not so intuitive or not what you were expecting is pretty normal for anybody who does research on, documents or any other type of information. Now, for example, you may well consult finding aids catalogs. You may go for structured querying if you use one of the bigger digital databases. And in many ways, what you do is a close reading of certain items or a superficial reading of other items, develop new leads and go iteratively through that process, trying to learn where do you best, look, which part of the structure contains the best reports, the best correspondence, or what are the best search terms, what should you be excluding or including. So it's an iterative process of trying to learn and understand the nature of that collection better. And that leads us to another problem, which is that of the empty search box. How do users actually navigate a search box when they're presented with it? And we all use search boxes because we use Google. And we all know we put a random question into Google and half the time we get reasonably good results. That's usually not the case if you go into some of the bigger digital collections. Some of them you still need Boolean search. And it means that people sort of expect very often tools that interpret the question and find relevant results. And Google is obviously excellent at that. And also the structure of the internet and the algorithm helps with that. It's quite hard to replicate that for some of the digital archive collections. And it means that users will more likely than not be sometimes a bit disappointed, I would say, with the results they get, because I think Google has really made us expect very high level of relevance from a search. Now, we wanted to look at Enron for various reasons. So MCODIST was originally trained on the archive that we presented earlier, which is also the digital history, but obviously as a tool, and this is available on GitHub. You have the link there at the bottom. We're happy to share the slides. It can, in principle, be trained on any other collection, and the Enron collection is obviously the one that is publicly available. You may have found it elsewhere on the internet. It's not always straightforward to search, and we thought, great, if we can maybe develop the search and see if this is a more accessible search, it is easier for people to search. That would be something that would be extremely helpful for people, and we would learn a lot about how people want to engage with these sort of sources. But Enron is an interesting archive because people know Enron for the big accountancy fraud. So they assume when they see the email archive, the emails will speak to that accountancy fraud. They do to an extent, but actually the emails are in the public domain due to a scandal in California around energy trading, and were made available in connection with that particular lawsuit. So as a result, what you actually find in that email database is a lot of material relating to energy trading in California, which is not what people expect. So in many ways, the collection is slightly different in structure from what people would expect. So there's a context around why this collection exists. And it helps to understand that if you're actually looking for material, because it tells you why you can't find certain things, but you might find a lot of other things. And then when we've presented this before and had other scholars look at Enron, very often they're interested in searching for terms like fraud. And obviously, if you are involved in fraudulent behavior, you probably don't tag that in your emails. So you're not really going to find it under the keyword fraud. And there's very interesting research about what are communication patterns for people involved in corrupt behavior, fraudulent behavior. We can't say we've that fully integrated, but again, I think the way people search is sometimes very straightforward, and you really need to sometimes think a little bit more laterally to actually find the sort of files you're interested in. And for all of this, context is very, very important. So the Enron email corpus, in many ways, has been used already to show all this email behavior before, but what it hasn't really been used to the same extent is to think about Enron as an organization that we might want to read what they were actually emailing to each other. And that's the interesting thing, because obviously the Enron case has largely overshadowed it. So that's why we thought, actually, even though it's a well-known email resource, it'd be really interesting to use MCODIST on this one. And that's what we've done. And the aims of this project are really finding out how researchers will actually search such an email collection. So what are their assumptions, and you know, what are the things we might wrongly assume other people would be interested in? So for us, it's really an attempt to understand better user preferences. What are they looking for in email? Are they looking for similar things to us, different things? And there's really quite a variety of what people find interesting. We also want to help with this in terms of how do we develop best practices for email-based research? So is there guidance? Is there ways in which we should be reporting on that kind of research to make it clearer to other people how results were achieved, or how people would want to use a tool to search them? And this tool is really something that we wanted to develop, that it is a tool that'll be useful for all sorts of other large email databases, whether they're currently publicly available or not, as we're working on the assumption that there will be a time when more email databases will become available and people will be interested in all sorts of different questions, including just trying to find out what is in that particular database, to see whether there's anything they find relevant. Now, this is the technical bit, and in our research team, Shantilata Kopili Venkata, who used to be at the National Archives, has developed the search algorithm that you can access on GitHub. And this really uses a number of different layers. As you can see, it uses NLP, which is widely used, but also a knowledge layer, which is perhaps quite an interesting aspect, because this is where we had the most conversations around what is it that we would want to look for, and how could the tool actually help us find that. So she's really the person who translated a lot of the requirements into the technology. So we are trying to use some of the tools that are used by Google, such as the BERT algorithm. That's an older version, so it's not quite as good as what you see on Google. We're also trying to help people restricting the scope of the search by asking certain questions around who are the users, what's the time frame, what's the kind of message, and trying to create these connections across different email accounts. Because if you go and see the Enron email corpus online, what you find is they're normally structured by custodians, so the different people's inboxes, essentially. And very often what you're interested in is their conversation. You're not just interested in one person, you're interested in the network of conversations that happens in an organization. So you really need to make those connections. Now, where we had discussions with Shanti was really the sort of classic questions you'll ask as a historian, as a journalist. You want to know who's involved, who's talking to whom, where are they located organizationally, when was it, how long did it last, and what was it about? Are there specific themes, events, occurrences that allow us to see clusters of conversation around certain things? Lawsuits, for example, are a classic one, or you may have a specific campaign. So you'll see a whole bunch of emails around a certain theme, and that might well be what you're interested in, rather than the individual people contributing to that debate. So this is how we decided to sort of structure the search tool. And to give you a bit of an idea of what this then looks like, so we called this MCODIST. A normal search, you would potentially just use keywords, right? So in a normal search, if you wanted to know about e-business trends between 2001, 2002, you might do a search that looks for all of these different terms. You may be able to link them in a Boolean way. It's possible. Now with MCODIST, we decided to offer two different types of searches to allow, researchers to have different ways of engaging, where we have MCODIST Basic that works on phrase matching. So here you would be able to connect e-business and trends, or e-business trends during a specific time period. it's very straightforward. You have a lot of control over that search. And when we done workshops with researchers, a lot of researchers, particularly in the social sciences, like that because they like the fact that they understand really well which term hits what email, and they can sort of understand that particular connection. And we have a different option, which is MCODIS Plus, which uses much more the attention-based content encoding I showed on the previous page. And it would really go out and try to think about effectively synonyms or terms people may have used. So we might be thinking about e-business trends, but people may have been talking about smart market trends or business collaborations more broadly. So it works as synonyms, as trying to understand what other terminology might be used around your search term, and would allow you to really open up the search into more of a discovery mode, where you're able to see, okay, I might be looking for a specific term, but at the time people use different phrases. And now I've learned the phrases and now I understand much better what my keywords should be. So you might then hop back to basic in order to just look for those keywords. So this is the sort of the structure. This is the tool. So if you go online to mcodis.com, this is the page you'll see, and you'll be able to choose the two different search modalities, MCODIS Plus and MCODIS Basic. So at the moment, this is still a trial version, so it's not quite finished. But essentially, I'll be talking you through Basic because this is where we've got at the moment most of the features. And this is an example if you look for, say, skilling resignation within the Enron dataset. So skilling was senior manager at Enron and involved in some of the fraud. So people might be interested in skilling and what he was doing. So you might search, you might get 106 results. That is sort of manageable, but you may still want to kind of look through those different ones, might want to collect them in a different way. In this case, because the search actually takes quite a long time, what we have done is we allow people to limit the whole data set to specific topics. So here we use some material from topic modeling. You can limit it to top management emails. That's quite a straightforward structural way. Obviously, you can search all emails. That'll take a long time. But you see the other themes are really topics. There are things that came up from the topic model where we know there's specific themes where there's a lot of email around, and you may actually want to dig into some of these specific ones, like energy trade is obviously the major one in this particular collection. You can also limit the date range. So that helps you to kind of really narrow down if you just want to see a specific time period. We have put in sorting by date, and plus you'll be able to sort by relevance. You can export the results. So you can get it all into a spreadsheet and then work with it, because obviously this is a publicly accessible resource. And we've implemented little features such like word cloud, and you just see where your search results actually hit in the entire database. So these are some of the options you have, and this allows you to do actually quite a structured search of the collection and report back what you found. Now, I'm not talking you through Plus at the moment because the online version has some bugs that we're trying to sort out. So we're not quite happy with the results. The ones from the online tool don't match the results from our test version that we have on the laptop. So we're still working on this. I mean, you can play around with it online, but the results don't make as much sense as they should. And we generally found with some of the researchers we worked with, they're quite like the basic version. So the way we really see the difference between the two is MCODIS allows you to explore the collection. Basic might be much more useful to you if you want to go through in detail. You don't have the issues around bias. You look for exact words, and you can create simple queries with very specific keywords. So as a knowledgeable user who understands the collection, this will give you very easily understandable hits, whereas MCODIS Plus is a lot more useful for browsing, getting to know a collection. But because of the various layers of the knowledge layer and the NLP involved, it can be harder to understand how the results are being generated by the tool. So this is the tool at the moment that we have available. And for us, this tool was really a sort of test version to find out around how email archives can deliver for researchers and other users who want to know about these kind of pieces of information, the content, the insight we can get from this type of correspondence. And our aim with it is really to accommodate diverse research questions. So we obviously came to resources with specific questions and assumptions, but the second part of the project is really to find out what questions are other people asking. allow users to go iteratively through a collection to kind of replicate that research experience you may have in a physical archive, to allow quite a tacit and messy approach to research, you know, getting to know and then becoming more shrewd at what you're trying to find, because that is very much part of qualitative research, and provide access for different levels of experience, so whether you know the resource particularly well or not. And the idea is really to offer a relatively complete access to a whole organizational email database, which at the moment there are not that many available, but we believe in the future that will hopefully change. And then we will need better tools, because then we have a needle in the haystack problem. We just have too many emails. This is by now actually quite a small email collection, and it's already quite difficult to navigate. So these are the sort of two aspects of our project. We're really looking forward to your comments and questions, and thank you very much for the invitation.
Well, thank you so much, Stephanie and Adam, for this wonderful presentation. So we have a few questions already from people who are attending online. So perhaps we can start with those questions. And of course, those people in the audience, if you have any questions, you know, there will be a chance to ask it. But let me start with a question from Lorenzo. So Lorenzo wants to know how many emails are preserved in the Enron database, and have the attachments been preserved? Because of course, attachments are a big issue when we are talking about email archives.
Yeah, I'll take that one. For Enron, it was originally released by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and when it was released, it was somewhere in the region of 600,000 emails, and it did include attachments, and it was essentially just the archive file taken directly from the organization's servers, to the point where one of the researchers I've spoken to who had this early version actually got it loaded up on Outlook, and that's how they researched the organization. The version you can access now, and the version we use, is one that has been rendered to deal with some privacy request issues, and also removes the attachments. And the reason why those attachments are removed are primarily because this version of the data set exists, or was created, to facilitate computation and information science usage, and therefore the attachments were less relevant. They were interested essentially in using it for the structural elements of the email in a non-consumptive way. So that's Enron. The other archive, we have the attachments. What we did was what David did, because he was doing this, was flatten those into text files. So you can access the content as long as it was textual content, but the images and the original form are not there. So they're essentially reborn digital in that regard, because they don't represent their original attachment form.
Maybe to add to that, it reflects the problem with the current email archives is they have been collected for computational use and for the structural large-scale use that looks really at how do people interact. They're not so much optimized for actually reading them. And obviously flattening attachments into text files sounds fine until you realize they're PowerPoint files in there. And a PowerPoint as a TXT is absolutely unreadable. So they're really not designed to be read, these early email archives, and that's maybe one of the formatting issues to be aware of.
Great, thank you so much. Another question, just to clarify, are we talking about all the emails from Enron, or just a selection, perhaps only for the lawsuit?
So with the MCODIS tool, we've got substantially all the emails, but we allow people to narrow down into specific themes just to make things easier to find.
So in terms, Enron, when it went under, was about 20,000 people working there, and we have 150 custodians. So in that regard, it's a very small percentage of the overall organization, and indeed the overall emails.
Yeah. So the collection that was made available was never the entire collection, right? So the collection that was made available had to do with the lawsuit. And this is why I said at the beginning, it is better for, say, looking at energy trading in California than looking at accountancy fraud, because that's why they were collected. But that collection that was made available, we used as a whole. But as Adam said, it's not the entire organization.
Fantastic. Another question from Lorenzo regarding your project. I mean, how did you deal with personal data, you know, especially when we consider the GDPR?
So for Enron, this wasn't an issue because it was publicly available. With the previous project, that was a major issue because that collection is publicly available through the Linguistic Data Consortium, but for what is called non-consumptive use, i.e. not reading. So people are not allowed to reproduce anything that is the content of those emails. Through our collaborator, David Kirsch, we know the data owners, which is a venture workout buyout firm. That means when firms are unsuccessful, they help them go through something like bankruptcy, but it's not quite bankruptcy. And as a result, they own all the data. And David has very good relationships with them. So we got special permission for a different use of that collection under the condition that we were to anonymize the data set. So when you go to the email archive website, we use pseudonyms both for the company and for the individuals in there. You'd be able to de-anonymize if you went to the Linguistic Data Consortium, but you're not allowed. So people have a degree of anonymity in the use because of that reason. But this is one of the big questions around email archives and how they will be treated by issues such as data privacy in the US, GDPR, and Europe and the UK.
Great, thank you so much. So we have a question from Nathan about ethical issues in relation to email archives, and that relates to what you were saying about data protection, right? So would you like to say a few words perhaps about these ethical issues?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, to a certain extent, the privacy issue sort of sits within that and presents one of the sort of key considerations. I guess where we are in time now, you have a recency effect in the sense that, you know, for instance, both of the email archives we're dealing with in these projects have individuals that not only are still alive, but also may still be working in those relevant sectors. So that's been a consideration, even in the case of Enron, where it's still publicly available. And that's not necessarily something that you would necessarily, a situation you would be used to dealing with as a researcher going in and using archival data. So I think that that's certainly part of the consideration. I think the other key consideration when we think about organizational emails is the ambiguity over ownership and usage. So nominally, organizational emails should relate to organizational business in the same way that we would expect memos and things like that to relate to the day-to-day business of the organization. But what you will find very quickly when you look certainly at the Enron emails, but also at the other organization, is that particularly in the early noughties, individuals were using these emails as their personal emails. They did not necessarily have a Yahoo account, that everything was going through their organizational emails. So you capture a lot of their life, as well as things that are certainly part of the organization's communication. And I think one of the biggest things, and this is particularly where you start doing searches that perhaps take from multiple items in the collection, is how you deal with the fact that you have that personal communication in there too. And that's something that essentially we screen out. But our way of dealing with that so far has been to screen it out as a researcher when we're analysing. But that's certainly a consideration. Then, of course, you've got the fact that if you're dealing with a US organisation, ownership of organisational email is relatively clear cut. It's owned by the organisation in legal terms. When you're dealing with it in other contexts, it's far grayer in terms of who owns that data.
Great, thank you so much. Another question about the search function that you described. I mean, is it working for attachments as well as for the email, the text in the email?
Technically, it works for attachments, but the one that we've got online is on the Enron data set that doesn't contain attachments.
Yeah.
So the one we've used for the other organization did contain attachments, but as I said, some of these attachments, when they're Word files, you render them in TXT, that's still quite readable. When we had PowerPoints, we've often really struggled dealing with those attachments, I have to say. But it works in principle. You don't get quite the same network effect, or you get the network effect through the email to which they were attached.
It's worth perhaps adding that in the website that provide the digital histories, we did actually recreate a PowerPoint because one of the hits we got was an attachment, which was a PowerPoint, and so we asked the designers of that website to reinterpret those PowerPoints in a way that was broadly authentic to the context and the era, and so we were able to at least reproduce the text, even though we had to do so ourselves. You know, the broader design and how it was framed was different.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. Lots of questions online. Do we have questions in the room from people who are here? Okay, lots of questions. So let's start perhaps with the gentleman at the back. Yeah.
Did you have any issues with duplication of emails? I think in particular conversation history. So every time somebody replies to an email, it almost generates that entire email trail.
We never don't have issues.
Sorry. Would you like to rephrase?
Paraphrase the question for the people online.
Yeah, so the question was around duplication, and yes, absolutely. So we did deduplication to an extent before, just to slim down the data set. But the other question is, you get duplication through the email threads. And actually, it's really good to have a thread sometimes because it means you can follow through, but that also means your search results get affected because the search result keeps on hitting the email thread, even though if they may have wandered on in terms of topic. But we opted to keep email threads in there for most of them because it was difficult to get the connection, right?
Yeah, so neither of us are really the best person to answer this question.
We had a lot of
my
discussions.
memory from what was decided was that simple duplications were deduped. The threads were kept in, so you will have duplications, but the tool searches the content of the most recent message, I believe, is the logic of how it returns results.
How well that always worked, I'm not entirely convinced with, but yeah, that was the.
But yeah, to be honest, it's an ongoing issue, and it was also a very big issue in work we were doing on email prior to this tool.
Great, thank you so much. We had another question.
Yeah, I was just curious if either of these companies or any other sets had a retention policy or an archive policy. Some organizations have these policies, whether or not they're enforced.
So the question was about retention, the retention policies.
Organization retention policies.
Honestly, I don't know. I know Enron, there is archives for Enron, some based in Texas. They're primarily things like the organization's magazine and other things. I think they did have some archival retention. They also shredded quite a lot of data.
An email one specifically.
I think that's very unlikely.
These are probably too early for the kind of email retention policies you see today. So the first data set, Aurora Tech, we call that company, but that's not its real name. The files go back, the earliest I think are just before 2000, but really most of them are 2000 to 2003, but really the bulk is 2001, 2002. Yeah. So there were no retention policies in that period. And then Enron is a very similar time period. So you're really looking at, this is just after email get really fully adopted in organizations on a large scale. It's sort of late 90s. So retention policies, I don't actually know when they come in, but we didn't get the sense there was really an official retention policy. People must have been deleting because clearly the email inboxes weren't that big.
Okay, great, thank you. Do we have other questions? Yes.
David Christian, Advocate on MIB TNA. So you've acknowledged the difficulty in getting these kind of complete email archives, but it also strikes me that era of kind of complete email archives and centralized organizational communication is very time-bound to kind of early noughties into the perhaps the last decade. Now we're moving into post-email age where we've got executive decision making through WhatsApp, and we've got marketing teams working on Teams, for example, and you've got software development and IT solving problems through Slack. Suddenly the idea of capturing that organizational context and content becomes on a much bigger scale. So I guess the question is, how do information managers begin to kind of tackle that?
You summarize it.
So the question is around email and what came after email, in particular Slack, Teams, shared drives, or WhatsApp as well, so that decision making and organizational processes are diffused across various platforms, and they're very difficult to capture. I think in terms of capturing them completely, it's hard to see how that will be possible. Obviously, a lot of people seem to think we're post-email, but I personally still get an awful lot of emails. So I think email will remain important, but obviously some of the issues we're experiencing with emails around the network nature and who has got access, that replicates into these various other forms like Slack. But it's different, and it's different in terms of search. So it's hard to know how we would search these or how these would be captured. I think at the minute it's hard enough to get to the email archives because we're only moving now into a time period where we can use them. I think these are recent, and maybe the large scale adoption is only 2-3 years for some organizations, and others were maybe earlier. I mean, we haven't really looked so much at preservation because we feel this is really an area where archivists have done a lot of work, and I know that's a really burning issue. But yeah, we think some of the search issues we've had will replicate into those types of information, but retention policies have become much sharper, right? I mean, a lot less is retained. So when people talk about retention policies, they really talk about destruction policies. I mean, other than the government, for private firms, they're very, very clear what shouldn't be in there. So
I think just to add on, as someone who doesn't manage information but does sort of study organizations, my intuition is that you're moving from managing a platform and how you're preserving key information on that platform to managing a system. And I think moving up to the system level where you have interconnections between those platforms is I guess where it will increasingly go. And how you prioritize. So for instance, on our own Slack channel, we would generally naturally archive key emails almost organically by sending them into the Slack chat. So how that works is I can't answer, but my hunch is a movement to a more system view. As you say, when you're thinking about email as a single platform, that's bounded in a particular period.
Great, thank you so much. So unfortunately, we're running out of time, so it's time for a break. But thank you so much for joining us online, and we'll be back in 15 minutes. Thank you so much.